Welcome to Elections, the Role of Nonprofits. Before we get started, just a little bit about public policy at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. At MCN, our goal is to promote and support and connect, inform individual nonprofits and the nonprofit sector. And for public policy, it's to encourage Minnesota's nonprofit sector to be their own voice in the public policy process. We do this through providing training on advocacy and lobbying and serve as a resource to policymakers on the nonprofit sector and advocate on issues that impact all nonprofits, things like incentives to charitable giving, nonprofit tax exemption, lobbying rights, and election activity rights. Civic engagement is an MCN tradition, and it's because we believe that when nonprofits participate in civic engagement, we reach community members who others are not trying to reach. And when communities are civically engaged, elected officials pay attention. And we know that when elected officials pay attention, nonprofits can further their missions through advocacy, and that elections and civic engagements is a part of the cycle of advocacy.
Thanks, Renal. My name is Leah Gardner. I am Outreach Coordinator for the Minnesota Budget Project at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and I am joined by an exciting lineup of great knowledgeable presenters. So in addition to myself here at the Council of Nonprofits, we have Renal Ray, and Renal is Public Policy Advocate here at the Council of Nonprofits, and we're joined by Isaiah Castilla, and he is Advocacy Programs Counsel for the Alliance for Justice, as well as Jeff Narrabrook, who is Voter Outreach Director at the Office of the Secretary of State here in Minnesota. So we're very excited to have our full panel with us to help talk about elections and the role of nonprofits. And today we have a few learning objectives. First, we want to make sure that we all understand the role of nonprofits in elections, and we want to make sure that you get a chance to learn how your organization specifically can engage in voter engagement, and want to make sure that we all understand the laws that relate to nonprofits and elections. And lastly, we want to share tips, tools, and resources related to nonprofit voter engagement. So along the way, please do feel free to chime in if you have any questions. And a reminder, as Renal said, you can do that through the chat function. To kick us off, I am going to welcome Jeff Narrabrook to talk about a preview of the elections this year in 2014.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? Leah, can you hear me?
Yep, sounds
Very
good.
All right. Well, we are only a matter of weeks away from another important election. The midterm election falls on November 4th this year. And, if you're on this webinar, you're probably pretty tuned in to the importance of all elections. But, not everybody understands that kind of every election can have big stakes and consequences. And at all policy levels, people are making important decisions. And unfortunately, I think in our society, people there's a group of people who kind of just tune in to presidential elections or kind of overemphasize the presidential elections and don't really tune in these so-called off years. But there are very important offices up around the country, and here in Minnesota, we have all of our state constitutional officers up, so the governor, the auditor, the attorney general, and the secretary of state's office. We have all of our Minnesota U.S. congressional districts up. We have a U.S. Senate race, and then we have Minnesota House representatives all up for election. That's in addition to lots of local races, so this is a year when there's lots of county races, county sheriffs, county commissioners. There's a lot of school district questions and some school board races, so there's a lot at stake. And I think that's one of the challenges for nonprofit organizations is maybe working with so-called low information voters or people who maybe aren't hooked into the news cycle or aren't kind of getting this message or not just not coming to it with a with an understanding of how our system works and how all these different layers of government work, and certainly how those affect their own lives. So one of the things that nonprofits can do, and it's not easy to do, but find ways to show people how, even within your own program, the decisions that are made at state level, let's say, definitely might impact their own lives. And that's one of the challenges we have before us, is getting people to tune in. Let's go to the next slide. And so why vote in the first place? This is a conversation that needs to be had with folks who aren't planning to participate in the election, maybe, or don't know that it's coming up. And in addition to your I voted sticker that you can be all showing off and arrogant about and show everybody that you vote, there's a lot of reasons why it matters to vote. And that's particularly important perhaps for people who are underrepresented in our society, don't have a lot of political power, because decisions can be made at their expense if they don't vote. That's how they exercise their power. One of the ways that people exercise power in the society is voting. And if you don't vote, you're literally, handing your power or giving your power to somebody else to decide for you. We know that elected officials see it as their job to feel accountable to voters. And so to the extent that you vote, and the people who are like you, have similar backgrounds, have similar concerns, vote or don't, that's going to really impact the public policy discussion that happens after the election. And we know that policy decisions skew towards the interest of voters. You're all familiar with kind of this concept, for example, that seniors are really reliable voters, and that elected officials, partly for that reason, are very sensitive to issues that may affect seniors. And that same kind of sensitivity may not be present for the concerns and interests of communities and individuals who are less likely to vote. So voting, I think a lot of people don't necessarily resonate with the civic duty language, or it's your right or your civic duty. That's true, but it's also meant to benefit you. And if people don't see their self-interest in it, they will be less likely to participate. On to you, Leah.
Thank you, Jeff. So, we have a role as nonprofits that I think is pretty unique. So we know that low-income communities, communities of color, and particular populations have historically had lower voter turnout. And like Jeff just said, we know that elected officials pay attention to that, and they're thinking about who votes when they're making policy decisions. So if we as nonprofits and those that we serve and work with in community want to have our voices heard and have influence in public policies that represent our best interests, we have to show up. We have to be a part of the full democratic process. And especially as nonprofits, we're all based in mission, and if our missions are about building strong communities where people can meet their full potential, I would argue that absolutely means that voter engagement is central to our missions. That, along with really the rest of the cycle of advocacy, where a powerful voting constituency are critical to our base and our ability to influence change. And so as nonprofits, we can reach populations that others can't in terms of get out the vote efforts. And to be honest, candidates, parties, and those that are sort of involved in this process from a political perspective, frankly, they're not focused on addressing low voter turnout. They're focused on winning, and really it's our job to focus on our communities and the populations that we want to make sure have influence. Another thing that's great for us as nonprofits is that, we do have that credibility as nonpartisan organizations. There's an awful lot of skepticism right now about the political process and elected officials, et cetera, and we can rise above that because we don't have politics in mind. As we do every day in our work, we're focused on our communities. And we, as nonprofits, have built trust and relationships, of course, with our communities throughout all of our work. So we really are the best messengers, I think, in encouraging people to vote. If you hear that message from somebody that you trust and that you value, it just means so much more. And history shows that it really does make a difference. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Isaiah to talk a little bit more about the law as it relates to 501c3 nonprofits.
Isaiah, it's *6 to unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, good. Great. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me, and I'm glad to be here. I'm Isaiah Castilla with Alliance for Justice, our Boulder Advocacy Initiative, where we work to strengthen the advocacy capacity of nonprofits across the country and work with them on election law and lobbying law and nonprofit tax law. And so just to start out, the law for 501c3s is very clear, and it's been clear for a while that no organization can support or oppose candidates for public office. And that's an absolute prohibition for public charities and for private foundations as well. These organizations can't support or endorse candidates. We can't contribute to candidates and the like. But there are a number of things that we can do in the election context, and we'll talk about some of those things in a second. It's interesting, as you see here on the screen, pre-1954, no laws regulating election-related nonprofit activity. And it's my understanding that based on the statutory history and some of the developments and why that prohibition came along was due to a nonprofit in Texas campaigning against Senator Lyndon Johnson at the time. And so, and as soon as he got back to the Senate, one of the main things he wanted to do was to make sure that that didn't happen again, that C3s weren't able to campaign against candidates vigorously. So that's just a little, nugget, little caveat that I thought would be interesting to add in. Now, it's also important to note that ballot measure questions, engaging in ballot measure advocacy for 501c3 public charities is considered to be direct lobbying and not partisan election-related activity. So that activity, when you engage in ballot measures as a C3, you can create research, you can work with communities to turn them out to vote for or against ballot measures, and it's not partisan political activity. However, it will count as lobbying, and it's subject to limits and reporting requirements. So how do we know whether or not something or an activity or a particular communication is partisan? Well, the way that we know that is something that we call the facts and circumstances test. And there's so many activities that we engage in or communications that we make as C3s around election time that can make things really uncomfortable for us as organizations. And the main reason why is because of this nebulous test, and it's called the facts and circumstances test. So we know we can't support or oppose candidates for public office. We know we can't contribute to those candidates. But there are sometimes activities that we might engage in that kind of fall into this gray area. And so there are, a few factors that as a C3 you should keep in mind, right? We look at things kind of as attorneys on this risk spectrum. So, press releases or certain ads, issue advocacy that we may engage in as C3s around the time of an election. How do we determine whether or not that communication is partisan or is high risk or low risk? Well, there are a few factors, okay? A couple of those things are proximity in time to election. How close are you to the election when you release that communication? The closer you get, the higher the risk becomes. Is it a platform issue? Are you discussing an issue that's extremely dicey, or is it a platform issue for one of the candidates? And have you established? Do you have an established track record of talking about or speaking out on that issue, right? So you want to make sure that you're not trying to ramp up criticism or just pick an issue out of the sky simply because it's, an important issue in the campaign, but that it's actually something that you as an organization have an established record on and you have talked about in the past. And again, documentation matters. You want to make sure that you have documentation to show that this is an issue that you've talked about, that you have established plans for lobbying or issue advocacy, so it doesn't look as if you're supporting or opposing candidates, so that you can say that we've got documentation. And the IRS, over time, they continue to release guidance through what we call private letter rulings or revenue rulings that have interpretation of these issues. And finally, perception matters, right? So sometimes something may not be it may not be off limits or particularly high risk for a C3, but it may just seem as if you're supporting or opposing a candidate, and maybe that's something that you take up as your staff with your board, and you really kind of discuss whether or not it's worth it. I always tell C3s to ask the question why, right? Why do we want to release this communication or get involved? If it's to encourage voting or to engage in advocacy as an organization around our issue, that's totally fine. But if it's to get involved in swing an election to one candidate over another, that's something we can't do. So staying nonpartisan in the workplace, it's always good to have a policy. Since we can't support or oppose candidates, we can do things in our individual capacity as C3s. We can, as an individual who works for a C3, So in your individual capacity, you can volunteer for campaigns, you can contribute to campaigns and attend campaign events. But while you're on the clock and you're in your capacity as an employee, it's important that you know that you can't support or oppose candidates for public office. So you're not using organizational resources to further the campaign of a particular candidate, and that employees should know and be aware that they can't use email and phone lines to help out candidates or work on behalf of candidates while they're on the clock and in the office. So always have a policy, and this trickles down also to volunteers who are working for your organization.
So Isaiah, at the Council of Nonprofits, our policy director and I, we get a lot of questions where nonprofits are kind of unsure of what they do. So I want to pose some hypothetical scenarios to you. And given what you've just shared with us, let's talk out how you might approach that situation if you were in it. So, for example, if a candidate wants to use our office space, is that something that's okay for a campaign-related activity? Is that something we should absolutely always turn down? How would you approach that situation?
Okay. Well, legally, as a C3, you could rent out your office space to a candidate. So let's say, for example, that you if it's a regular activity or something that you do already, right? If you already rent out your conference room or allow your conference room to be used by other organizations, and you charge, say, for instance, what we call fair market value for that service, that is something that a candidate could take advantage of. However, it's important to keep in mind that if another candidate, say a candidate who may not, kind of fit into your your way of thinking, right? If another candidate who may disagree with that other candidate who rented that room wants that same opportunity to rent that space at fair market value, you have to allow them to do that. So once you kind of open that door, you have to remember that that door is open and all candidates should have the opportunity to take advantage of that service.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for that clarification. Now, what about if a staff member shows up to work wearing a campaign T-shirt? Is that okay, or does that strike against being nonpartisan for an organization?
This is a tough one, because it's hard to tell a staff member either go home or take the shirt off or that kind of thing. This is why it kind of goes back to what I said before. Have a policy, right? So that you talk to employees beforehand or in their employee handbook, that they read, that they and sign off on, that they know that as an employee at your charity or foundation that we can't support candidates, and it really just makes it really uncomfortable if you wear campaign paraphernalia to the office. Now, if it's just one of those situations where they show up with, a campaign T-shirt on and, you really can't send the person home or ask them to change, I don't think it's going to be life or death for your organization. But, this just kind of goes back to that question, to that point about having a policy. But I don't think that it's a life or death matter for the organization if a staff member shows up with a campaign T-shirt. But
Right.
yeah.
So it sounds like it's some of having a policy, but also a little bit about educating nonprofit staff on what it means to be nonpartisan in the workplace as well.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, the last hypothetical we have. So if our executive director in their personal non-work time in life supports a candidate, but their picture ends up in that campaign, in some campaign material. How would you approach a situation like that?
So there are a couple of things here. So as in your individual capacity, even as an executive director, you could support a candidate, right? And if you end up in a picture, in some campaign material, and you're unidentified as that executive director, I think, legally that's not a problem. I think a problem can occur, number one, if you appear in that campaign material as executive director of public charity X, who endorses this campaign. That could be a problem. Another problem could come from the perception issue, which was on one of the earlier slides. So even if the executive director isn't identified, if the executive director is so well known and so associated with the organization that the perception is that the ED, when you see that picture, you see the organization. I mean, that could cause a perception problem for the organization. That's not necessarily a legal issue, but it presents some perception issues that could lead to problems in the media, for example. Some organization that doesn't agree with you on something calling your ED out and saying, you're endorsing candidates, and that could just create issues. So oftentimes organizations have to make the decision on whether or not you should appear in certain photos even as an individual because of the perception. And that's something that only your organization or only that ED can really decide. But yeah. So legally, it's not a problem if it's as an individual, but it could lead to perception issues.
Great. Thanks for chiming in on those. That's really clarifying.
Yeah, no problem.
So we're going to move on a little bit. So now we know that voting is important, that elections are important, and that nonprofits can participate in elections through voter engagement. So how exactly do we do that, or what are some of the ways that we can get in the game? So if we think about these three categories, voter registration, voter education, and voter mobilization, that's where nonprofits can really make a lot of impact in connecting with low turnout voters or their constituency. So we're going to turn it back to Jeff Narrabrook to talk a little bit about voter registration.
Thank you very much. Okay, so when it comes to voter registration, one of the questions sometimes nonprofits have is, well, can we register people to vote? That's absolutely allowed and encouraged, and in fact, if you have a contract with the state of Minnesota, you are required to provide voter registration services to the public. And some organizations aren't aware of this. There's not really an enforcement mechanism. But it's something to note that you may actually, if you receive state funds, you may be required to offer voter registration. There's no, some states kind of have a process where you need to become deputized and trained in order to offer voter registration. Minnesota doesn't have that kind of requirement, but we do want everybody to be educated on what those rules are. And so if we go to the next slide, we'll briefly go over some of the eligibility questions and highlight some of the most frequent questions that people have. So to vote in Minnesota, you must already be a U.S. citizen, and this is either to vote or register. You need to be at least 18 years old on election day. If you are 17 and you'll be 18 by election day, you can register. You need to be a Minnesota resident for 20 days. And you need to be finished with a felony sentence. I'm going to come back to this one. And the last one, if you're under guardianship, you can vote unless a judge specifically revoked your right to vote, which is relatively rare. So most people under guardianship retain their right to vote. And other kind of maybe similar legal forms that you may be familiar with, like conservatorship or power of attorney, none of those have any impact on your right to vote. The only one that could is if you're under guardianship, and that's only if a judge explicitly revoked that right. So let's go back to the what do you tell somebody if they say, well, I've had a felony sentence? This is one of the most commonly confused areas of election law. The reason is because each state can set their own law about how to treat eligibility for people who have committed felonies. So you end up with some states, there's two, where you never have your right restricted. You can even vote while you're incarcerated. There's other states where, as a practical matter, it's pretty much impossible or very difficult to ever get your right to vote back. And then there's a lot of states somewhere in between where you either get your right back immediately upon release from incarceration or upon completion of probation or parole. Minnesota is a state where you get your right automatically restored once you've finished your probation and your parole. So you're going to inevitably, if you're working with somebody who's had a criminal conviction, a felony, you're inevitably going to get kind of two unfortunate scenarios. You're going to talk with people who say, no, I'm a felon, I can't vote. Well, if you ask them, well, have you finished your sentence? Yeah, I finished it 10 years ago or whatever. They can register and vote and may be under the impression that they can't. And then you're also going to encounter people who are still serving their probation and parole and aren't aware that they can't vote. So there's a lot of confusion out there. The main point to take home is, yes, you can register and vote if you've finished all the terms of your sentence. A lot of people call that off paper. So if they're off paper, they can vote. And also if there's any doubt or if they're not sure, if they know that they're not completed, they absolutely shouldn't register because they could get in additional legal trouble. So we want everybody to know the rule. Everybody who's eligible, go ahead and register. And people who don't or have doubts, they need to clear that up before moving forward. A little bit about the registration process. So we went over eligibility. How do you get them registered? Well, we're getting closer now to the election and the October 14th pre-registration deadline. So mark that down in your calendar. That's one important date. And you're the way you treat registration before and after that date is different. Prior to October 14th, you'll want to pre-register people to vote, and you can do that by distributing and collecting paper registration forms. You can get those online at our site. You can also encourage people to register online directly at our site, which is a newer option for voters this year. The importance of pre-registration is that it clears up any doubts about their eligibility. It gets them all ready to go for Election Day. They don't need to bring additional items. They'll get a card in the mail telling them where they vote. It's much better for the voter if they pre-register. It leads to quicker time on Election Day itself, so they're not standing in line waiting to register. So please encourage pre-registration. We are one of the states that does offer same-day registration, which is one of the reasons we have such high participation among other states in the country. And same-day registration is kind of a vital tool that allows a last chance for voters to register who haven't pre-registered. I think part of the message is if you can register in advance, please do. It's better for the system. It's better for you. If you need to register on Election Day, by all means do so. And there's a different set of instructions for registering online. They'll need to bring a proof of residence, it's called, to show that they reside in the precinct. And there's a whole number of options for that. If you go to our website, you can also find that. We have a handout that might be good to distribute that after October 14th that lists all the different ways that people can register on Election Day.
So speaking of voter registration, about 6 weeks before the election, there is going to be a National Voter Registration Day. Now, many of you may already be involved in this effort, and in fact, there's over 1,500 organizations and companies that are already participating. But it's basically a day, or some people turn it into a week, to register voters ahead of pre-registration deadlines. So lots of organizations will obviously mobilize volunteers, educate eligible voters, actually register them, change the conversation around voting and registering. If that seems like a heavy lift, there are some other things that your organization can do. You can sign up as a National Voter Registration Day partner and have access to a communications toolkit. So maybe on National Voter Registration Day, your organization sends out an email or has a social media campaign that really encourages people to register if they haven't already and educates people on that process. Perhaps you have folks coming in and out of your organization every day. You could set up a table to capture the attention of people and have an opportunity to register and educate people in that way. If you think you'd like to get involved in the effort but are not quite sure what you can do, connect with either Leah or I, and also check out the National Voter Registration Day website. All right, Jeff, I'm turning it back to you to talk a little bit about the process of voting, and then we'll have Isaiah talk about educating voters on candidates.
Very good. So in addition to voter registration, there's a whole host of things you can do to just prepare voters and get them the information they need in order to participate. So just going through the when, where, how, what, talking to them about the dates, letting them know that they should pre-register by October 14th, letting them know about November 4th, letting them know that there is, just one polling place location that they need to go to. Not everybody understands that you're assigned one. Some people think, can vote. If I'm walking by a polling place, I can go in and vote. Not everybody understands that's not how the system works. So let people know they'll need to locate their polling place and that the hours are 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. for most precincts in the state. You can let them know that if they're not going to be able to vote on Election Day for any reason, they can vote absentee. And for the first time this year, voters in Minnesota do not need to require to list a reason why they want to vote absentee. In the past, a voter who wanted to vote absentee could only do so based upon a number of reasons, like I'm going to be physically absent from the precinct, I'm ill, disabled, can't get out of my house on Election Day, things like that. Now anybody can request and vote with an absentee ballot for just because they want to, even if they will be available to vote on Election Day. So we expect to see an uptick in absentee voting. They can apply directly to get their absentee ballot on our website. People may have questions about what IDs you need to bring, how to get help, Election Day registration rules, rides. Our website, we have an FAQ section that has a page specifically for each of these questions. It'd be great if you could familiarize yourself with them a little bit and be prepared to answer some of those if people have questions. One new law unique to this year that people may not have heard about yet is that all fixed route public transit in the state will be offered free of charge on Election Day. So this hasn't been done in the past, and the legislature passed a law requiring it for this fall. It's not funded for future years, so I guess they'll decide whether they're going to continue it or not. But basically, any Metro Transit fixed route, and then all the regional areas that have their own transit hubs, places like Rochester and Duluth and Moorhead that have their own transit systems, all of those systems will offer their fixed route rides free on Election Day. So that's something to share with people. What is not included is Metro Mobility or their related services in other parts of the state where people need to call and schedule a ride. This is only fixed routes that go on a normal schedule. Finally, sample ballots you can get from our website. This is a really important thing because, as nonprofits, you can bring people together to hear from the candidates at a debate, but you don't really have a means to have impromptu conversations or just kind of tell people about what's on the ballot. The sample ballot is really nice because that's something you can just print and hand to them. You don't need to be talking about who the candidates are. You're giving them the information, and then they can go look it up themselves. You'll need to, if you happen to work with a population that's geographically located in one area or a couple areas, maybe you could print out a couple ballots for each precinct, or if you happen to have one, that's something you can have on hand, or direct them to our website to find themselves. That's all I have for the education piece right now.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to talk about voter guides and candidate questionnaires. It's important to point out that, like I said, as C3s, there are so many things that we can do and so many activities that we can engage in, even if we can't outright support candidates. And one of those things is one of those ways to participate is to create voter guides and candidate questionnaires. So as C3s, you can put together a candidate questionnaire that you send to all the candidates. And once the candidates respond, you can put that information into a voter guide and make sure that that the community and your constituents and everyone, frankly, has access to candidates' answers. There are a few things, however, that you should know and keep in mind when you put together a candidate questionnaire or a voter guide together. Make sure that you cover a broad range of issues in your questionnaire. So you want to have open-ended questions. You don't want to try to lead a candidate to a specific answer or ask a candidate to take a pledge. A C3 can't ask a candidate to pledge to support a certain thing. For example, if elected, will you support comprehensive immigration reform? A C3 would want to avoid that type of question. You want your questions, again, to be unbiased. This is one of those activities, that I always think, when you do a questionnaire, it's good to do it with other organizations because it's easier to cover a broad range of issues. It's easier to have unbiased questions and not try to lead a candidate to impress your specific organization. And the opportunity for more candidates to participate is greater, right? Candidates will want, even if they may not be inclined to answer the questionnaire for your organization, maybe there are a couple of organizations in that coalition that they're interested in or whose constituents they know would want to hear their answers. So they may participate, if you're working a coalition. create a plan to promote your answers to constituents and partners. And also, if a candidate doesn't respond, you want to indicate that the candidate chose not to respond. Also, I always say it's good to have a word limit on these candidate questionnaires so that when candidates respond and you publish those answers, they look similar. So one candidate, if one candidate talks on and then another has a shorter answer, that can't, the argument can't be made that one candidate looks better than the other just from the words that are given. So have a word limit, print their answers out just the same, same types of pictures. You just want to make sure that they look, that you give each candidate an equal opportunity. So candidate events. You'll hear some of these same themes reoccur as we talk. These themes of inviting all qualified or viable candidates, making sure that each candidate has an equal opportunity to present their views, right? Those are some of the same things we just talked about, right? Having open-ended questions that allow a candidate to present his or her views and to get their point across. And also, you want to make sure that there is a moderator, a neutral moderator who moderates in an unbiased manner and doesn't give one candidate an edge over another, either implicitly or explicitly, right? And you want to make sure as a C3 that you're not trying to stack the deck against a candidate. So, for example, you make sure, you want to make sure that you don't invite all of one candidate's supporters, and you don't make sure that other candidates have the opportunity, or that you send you send the invite out to one list over another. You want to make sure that you are as neutral as possible, and that you cover a broad range of issues that are important to not only your constituency but the community at large. And this is another example of the type of activity that could be done well with other organizations or in coalition, because it's easier to cover a broad range of issues and to get more candidates to appear in this type of environment when you work in coalition. So there are different types of candidate events. So there, we have debates, we have forums, we have, fairs, we have meetings, and then I'll also kind of go into talk a little bit about having candidates appear in their capacity when they're not, speaking as a candidate, right? So when it comes to debates, you want equal time for each candidate. Make sure that you invite all viable candidates to appear. Have a prepared and spontaneous debate. For a forum, same kind of principles apply. Equal time for each candidate. Your candidates can attend the event individually. And so these are just some important rules to keep in mind. And then there are times when, for example, you may want someone who's a candidate to appear in their capacity as a legislator or an individual. In that case, right, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, you want to make sure that that person, that candidate knows up front that this appearance is not about your candidacy. It is about your expertise on the school to prison pipeline, and we'd love to have you come talk about that. Now, if you do that, I always suggest a disclaimer letter to the campaign and to the official office so that they know what the nature of the event is. Also, that you make sure it's not too close to the election, right? The closer you get to the election, the more it may look as if you're trying to endorse a candidate implicitly. And so you want to keep those types of things in mind when you have events that folks who are candidates who are also elected officials may be participating in.
All right, Isaiah, it's Renal again, and we have a question from a webinar participant that really mirrors a lot of questions that we get about candidate events. And so if you have a public forum that's about voter education and you invite some candidates, you invite the candidates to show up in the way that you've just talked about, but only one candidate accepts the invitation. There are a few questions there. Should you continue with the forum? Does that mean, and if you don't continue with the forum and you have that one candidate, is that an implicit endorsement of the candidate? And what does that mean for the organization?
Well, we get this question a lot, and I think in this situation, and the organization has to make a judgment call about perception, and also just understand that if one candidate appears, it's no longer a forum, right? It's no longer a debate, and you are giving that candidate the opportunity to get their views across to members of the community and your constituents without the opportunity to hear an opposing viewpoint. And as C3s, our job is not to tell people how to vote or lead people to a particular party or candidate. Our job is to make sure that everyone has all of the information so that they can make the best decision for them, for their families and their communities. So often, in this situation, I think when you only have one candidate show up, that's a situation where you probably should not go through with that event. I think that's just a very high-risk proposition for a 501c3 public charity, because if it's one candidate, it's no longer a forum or debate. And it could appear as if you are implicitly endorsing that candidate. Even if you say, hey, listen, we've got a letter, we sent, I just think that's not a good situation to put your organization in.
All right, thanks for that analysis. So another question, let's say you have a diverse panel of candidates, all the qualified candidates are in the room, and it's a town hall style gathering where audience members can ask questions. And there's one audience member that asks a leading or a partisan question. How do you handle that situation?
That's a good question. So sometimes I think there's certain things, and this is to me kind of one of those questions that's similar to the question earlier about having when you have a staff member show up in a campaign T-shirt. There's some things that as far as the way the law works, you might see it one way, but then practically, we also have to be practical. I'm an attorney, but my background is in campaigns, and I know there are some things that you can't control, right? Whether you're with a C3 or a campaign or whatever. So, I think it's important from the outset for the organization to make clear that we can't support or oppose candidates for public office. Maybe something that you do is that you have questions that you've prepared already, that you make sure that the audience members know there's certain kinds of questions, and so if someone gets up and they ask a question that's leading or it's partisan, or they start to go on a partisan rant, you can't really control that, right? That's that audience member. You can't really, I guess you could run up to them and take the mic, but other than that, you just kind of have to go with it. And maybe after they ask that question, you maybe kind of come on as an employee of the C3 and you say, hey, listen, we don't support or oppose candidates for public office, and so leading or partisan questions we're not going to allow in this type of venue. And that's the only way that I could see that situation being handled. But, there's not too much you can do. As long as you're clear as an organization and you make every reasonable good faith effort to prevent those types of things from happening, I think it's that's not a big problem.
That's really great
for the
guidance.
organization. Yeah.
That's really great guidance. Thanks for that, Isaiah. And now we're going to turn it back to Jeff for him to spend just a few minutes to talk about voter mobilization.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about voter registration, voter education. Now we're going to talk for a couple minutes on voter mobilization, get out the vote. One of the key findings that social scientists have found when they have kind of looked at why people vote, what motivates them, is that, and this is true I think in many areas of life, but the more personal it is, the more likely you are to respond to it. So that means, for instance, if you see the last bullet, the content of mobilization messages is not important as the quality, timing, and delivery of message. Another way to say that is it's not what you say that's important as much as who says it. So what this means is if you have existing relationships with community members, you already have an in and you can make more of a difference. One of the consistent findings they've found is that people who have friends and family who vote are more likely to vote. People who don't have friends and family that vote are less likely to vote. So it's a social behavior, voting is, and you are part of their social connections, and you provide, probably an important role in their life, whatever role your nonprofit plays. So that's really the leverage that you bring, is as a trusted voice, and that's the kind of the place that you want to speak to people from. Let's go to the next slide for the sake of time. A couple of ideas for what you can do as Election Day is approaching. Get your staff educated on some of the basics. We have on our website a guide to voting section under common questions or FAQs that has a PDF that you can print out so that people can answer basic questions. It's good to ask people proactively, what time are you going to be voting on Tuesday? Do you know where you're going? Are you going to need a ride? Figure out what it is they need if there's a barrier. Letting people know, for instance, that they're entitled to time off from work in order to vote. They're legally entitled to that. That's something a lot of people don't know. Probably there's employers that don't know that. There's employees that don't know that as well. And one of the most impactful things you can do is just get on the phones for a little time. If you have have case lists or you have client lists, give your staff an hour or two the Monday before Election Day to call some people and say, hey, I'm just checking in. There's an election tomorrow. Wanted to make sure you're prepared to vote. Is there anything I can do, any information you need? And those kinds of last-minute reminders make a big difference because we can talk to people in March and April and September and October, but it's really, are they going to show up on that Tuesday? And if you're able to reach them that day before, you have a better chance. On Election Day, you can kind of throw a celebration, make it a visible thing, make it something fun, put up signs, and kind of everybody who comes in that day, whether it's staff or members of the public, ask them if they voted, remind them they have until 8 p.m. that day to get in line to vote, and just get the word out.
So at this point, we'd love to hear from you on any questions that you have. So if you haven't had a chance or if your questions haven't been answered, feel free to type them in. And while you do that, I'll just go through some tips, tools, and resources on voter engagement for nonprofits. There are a lot of them, including MCN's own election module. If you're familiar with the Minnesota Participation Project from years past, much of that content has been moved into MCN's election module. Also, the Secretary of State's website is a wealth of resources. There's a poll finder there. You can figure out if you're already registered and get links to other fact sheets and information. The Alliance for Justice, where Isaiah is on staff, has some really great resources as well. Check out their Electoral Activity Center and the Boulder Advocacy website. Especially if you want to learn a little bit more about candidate events and how to stay nonpartisan in voter engagement. Nonprofit Vote is another really great national organization that's dedicated to increasing the capacity of nonprofits to do voter engagement. And so they've got really great recorded webinars and other written resources that might be helpful. Again, there's the National Voter Registration Day website, so for you to get your communications toolkit and other promotional materials to get ready for September 23rd. A newer thing that I've just learned about is that the Pew Charitable Trust has a new voting information project that has some pretty unique tools. So those are some tips, tools, and resources. And as always, if you have additional questions or would like to get connected to either one of the other two presenters, please feel free to connect with either myself or Leah Gardner. We're the MCN Elections team this year and would love to help you think through any questions that you have or connect you with other resources. We've got about 2 minutes left, so if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in through the chat. Jeff or Isaiah, if there's anything that I kind of cut you off on by advancing a slide too early and you wanted to pipe in, this would be a great time to do that as well.
No, at all. I think it's just as long as people know where to get more information, and we encourage them to plan something, whether it's something big or small, to help prepare the community to vote.
Okay, thanks Jeff. There's one question from Eric through the webinar. The question is, are you aware of any voting guides for statewide elections that are available?
So I can talk about that, Renal. The answer is no, unfortunately. I haven't seen any. The League of Women Voters in Minnesota has frequently in the past been able to put out that guide. They weren't able to do that this year. So no, and I'll just say sometimes getting nonpartisan voter education materials like candidate questionnaires or candidate guides, that can be a real challenge, and there's not really a good solution for that I've seen out there. There are certainly interest groups that will do candidate guides, but that's through the lens of their issues.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Jeff and Isaiah. It's really nice to have a national expert and a really great state expert on the call to help us work through this webinar so we all better understand the role of nonprofits in elections. So on behalf of MCN, thank you, Jeff and Isaiah, and thank you to those of you who are able to make it on the call. Again, we have recorded this webinar, and it will be available to you within the week on the elections module. And we'll also send a follow-up email with a link to the PowerPoint slides, the tips and resources, as well as the module. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.